About 6 months ago, I was riding in a funeral procession with a local funeral director and just asked him, I said, Bob, what are you seeing locally with regard to this? And his response was sort of stunning. He said, Troy, in the last 10 days, I've had 3 pickups in Mechanicsburg Borough. 3 in 10 days. And he shared a little more and started to think, this is about ready to implode and explode in different ways. And rather than continue to dwell on my own ignorance, it was time to become equipped with information and then to allow my heart to be led by God. That led me to Pastor Bichard, who the funeral director mentioned is doing one of those services. And I'd like to just invite Bob forward at this time, because in my conversation with him and his experience, I found out that if he's dealing with that in a faith community that averages maybe a third of what Aldersgate does, it's just a matter of time here. But he used the word insidious, the insidious nature of this addiction. And I'd like to invite Bob forward to share briefly. We have Bob lined up for about 8 minutes, and then we'll move into our first of 2 central presenters for this evening. Bob?
Good evening. I do want to thank Troy for inviting me here this evening, and also Carol Diffenbaugh. We've had a few conversations about the issue. And unlike a lot of the presenters that you might have here this evening over the next few weeks, I really don't have a lot of statistics to share with you tonight. What I would share with you is more one from a personal experience and encounters that I've had, particularly over the last couple years. It's just an honor to be a part of it. It's sad because it is such an insidious thing that's going on in our culture today. One of the things that the personal experience has allowed us to do at Young's Church is to start the Family Forum on Addictions. Jill Whitmire, one of our members, had come to me following an encounter, some things that were happening in her own family, some other things that were happening in our church, and she said, ask if we could possibly start something that could help families cope with and deal with the issues of addictions with their loved ones. So it wasn't an opportunity for us to host another AA meeting or an NA meeting. It was looking at it solely from the perspective of what kind of struggles are the families themselves, many of whom have reached the end of their rope in dealing with the cycle that is going on with their loved ones. And I'll explain that in a moment. So we prayed about that, and one of the things that I felt was really happening was that the Holy Spirit was prompting us to do something to reach out to the family. So it was really something that was born out of necessity. Troy alluded to the fact that Young's Church on a given Sunday could have anywhere from 80 to 100 people there. Well, right now we have at least 6 families who are dealing with addictions from varying degrees, and I'll just share varying stages of what they're coping with. We have one that, for instance, is dealing with recovery. He's been drug-free for upwards of about 2 to 3 years now, 2.5 years. We have another individual that chose jail rather than go to rehab. We have another one who I will put in a category of functioning addict, and I will say that word marginally because of being able to hold a job, but still struggling with the issue of addiction. And then we have another category that I would call cycling. In other words, there's a cycling process of going from jail to rehab to relapse, and just over and over and over again. And in the case of one that sadly is deceased now because of the overdose, it was a case where the parents had paid huge amounts of money for rehab that they didn't have to pay out, and ultimately they still lost their daughter. And so it was in light of that when Troy and I had just done, I guess maybe the funeral about a month and a half before we talked. We were at a breakfast meeting together when the subject came up. And I would just like to share with you the conversation that happened leading up to the funeral, at the funeral, and then following it. The woman who died was not a teenager, was not in her 20s. She was actually in her 40s. She became addicted to heroin and opioids after a lengthy surgeries and multiple surgeries and pain that had developed, and through the cost of prescription meds and that sort of thing, was turned on by a friend and became addicted. She fought that for a number of years. She was initially, maybe we would say, functioning, but she eventually ended up in that cycle from rehab to relapse. A few weeks before she died, she had a new start in life. She had moved away from this area. She had gotten a new job, had a new boyfriend, and in fact had texted her father and said, "This is the happiest I've ever been in my life." At some point over the weekend, she came back to pick up some personal items at home. Some of those friends caught up with her, and they went for a ride, and she returned home, only to find that a day later that she died of an overdose. So that hope that this family had was quickly dashed. The father, well, let me just say, the parents are like a lot of parents. They're some of the nicest people you would ever want to meet. They would give you the shirt off their back. They struggled for a lot of years. Interestingly enough, at the funeral, before the funeral, the father asked me if I would give them hell. Because he knew that the people who were going to be at the funeral were going to be the very same friends who had gotten her the heroin. And so I struggled with that as the pastor. How do I, as a pastor, impart grace at that moment that is needed for the family, and yet at the same time be condemning at the eulogy? And so I did. I shared the words of grace for the parents' sake, which they needed. And then I shared some information about a seminar that I had attended. Before I got there, though, I was out on the sidewalk at the funeral home talking with one of our congregants, and off to the side I overheard a conversation. And the comment that was made was what I shared with Pastor Troy as being so insidious that it literally just irritated me to the bone. And it was, boy, that must have been some pretty good stuff. I wonder where she got it. And as that comment resonated with me, I became rather irritated to think that here we are at a friend's funeral, and yet that conception that I wish I could get my hands on some of the stuff that was being shared amongst friends. So with that in mind, I shared this eulogy just briefly. You see, I'd attended a seminar where political leaders and law enforcement and judicial officers and rehab facilitators and drug and alcohol agency personnel, medical personnel, had all gathered together to talk about this issue of addiction, particularly with heroin and opioids. And as I was sitting there, I was thinking about there's one segment of our society that is missing, and that is the spiritual side of things. And so what I shared with the people that day, I will share with you, that until we look at this from a spiritual aspect, and until we can address this from a spiritual point of view, we can continue to spend millions of dollars to resolve the issue. I don't think we'll ever fix it. And without that part of it being part of the fix. What I shared with him that day is this. Scripture tells us that the devil seeks to steal, kill, and destroy. He will absolutely steal your loved ones from you. He will take their life. He roams around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And if you are one of those, as I shared with them that day, if you are one of those who was out on the sidewalk earlier wondering how good the stuff was that she got and where you could get it, I will share this with you. Someday, your parents will be sitting in this seat, and I pointed to the couple from our church that was sitting in the front seat sobbing uncontrollably. Someday, that will be your parents. And someday, your body will lie in the box over here because of that insidious thought that this can't happen to you. Let me tell you about a man who died on a cross so that you and I could have life abundant, to have it to the full, and to understand that Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, died for us. Not to take our life as the evil of heroin does, but to provide life. Jesus, when he was tempted in the wilderness, was tempted physically, emotionally, and spiritually. All of us gather together in groups in the hopes of resolving the issue physically and emotionally. But I'm here to share with you that until we look at it from a spiritual point of view, as a spiritual attack, I don't think we'll ever resolve it. And that's the story that I would just share with you here today. Thank you.
As I heard from Bob, that story and the insidious was the word he used, nature of the addiction. It just kept resonating in my heart. And we have police officers, variety of police officers in this faith community. We have medical providers, we have pharmacists, and the more I talk with individuals, the more I grew fearful but also hopeful that we could offer a response to equip the mind and sensitize the reach of the heart. So we encourage you again to look at that outline over the next 4 weeks, the 3 ensuing weeks, and to spread the word, because we have some people here that I think God can use to equip our minds and sensitize the reach of our hearts proactively. I'd like to introduce for you at this time our first of 2 presenters as we move along this evening. Jack Carroll is the Executive Director of the Cumberland Perry Drug and Alcohol Commission, responsible for managing public-funded substance abuse prevention, intervention, treatment services for residents of Cumberland and Perry counties. Jack has worked in various capacities within the drug and alcohol field since graduation from Penn State in '76. He's a native of Johnstown. He lives in North Middleton Township, and we'd like to invite Jack forward to share. We have a time of about 40 minutes for this portion, and then we'll move to Fern Wilcox, and then we'll have times of question and answer. So won't you welcome Jack among us tonight?
Thanks, folks. Thank you for having me this evening. My hats go off to Aldersgate. A number of churches have helped in responding to this horrible opiate epidemic that we're wrestling with right now. But I have to say that Aldersgate is the only church that has put together such a comprehensive 4-part seminar. And so that's just terrific. I strongly encourage you to look at the full series and take advantage of the other sessions as well. As was already mentioned, our agency is responsible for managing public funding for substance abuse prevention, intervention, and treatment services for our 2-county area. And by far the largest problem we have, and that we have had for the past at least 3 to 5 years, has been this growing opiate epidemic. A couple years ago, a number of folks from Cumberland County went to a statewide seminar where we learned more about all aspects of this this health crisis. And we decided to form a task force. And that's mentioned up on the slide, the Cumberland County Community Opiate Overdose Prevention Initiative. And this presentation that I'm going to provide you is one of the activities that has come out of that coalition. We have been active in the past 2 years going to any group that might have an interest in this. And so I'll give a commercial right now. If at the end of this presentation you think there's some benefit to it and you're part of some other group, whether it's a Lions Club or some other type of organization that you think could benefit, please don't hesitate to give us a call, and we would do a similar presentation and tailor it for your group. The point of this, and I think why we chose to put this at the beginning of your series, is we're going to attempt to give an overview of this health epidemic and how we ended up in this situation, because it didn't happen overnight. It's been a perfect storm that's taken about a decade in the making. And so it's not surprising that we're not coming out of it very quickly as well, because it's a rather complicated and comprehensive mess that our society is involved in. So at the beginning, just a few points to underscore the magnitude of the problem. We're experiencing unprecedented levels of drug overdose deaths in our country. In the latest year that we have figures for on a national level, 2015, according to the Centers for Disease Control, over 52,000 people died of unintentional drug overdoses. This does not include folks that chose to take their life through suicide by overdosing on drugs. These are unintentional or accidental deaths. That's the equivalent of 143 Americans every day. Pennsylvania is right up there near the top of the list in terms of our mortality rate. Based on the 2015 national data, we have the 6th worst rate. They measure the rate by number of deaths per 100,000 population, and ours is 26.3. There are a number of states in our area that fall in the top as well. Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky. Some folks point to the Rust Belt and coal mining areas as being particularly hard hit by this epidemic. And another data bite that we have is from the Pennsylvania State Coroners Association. According to the data they gathered, there were over 3,500 overdose deaths in Pennsylvania in calendar year 2015. One measure of how bad it's gotten, drug overdoses are now surpassing motor vehicle accidents as a leading cause of accidental deaths, both nationwide and in Pennsylvania. This next chart shows this. I'm sorry, it's not quite as clear. This shows the trend in overdose deaths and the parallel trend in car accidents. You can see we're making progress in car accidents. Until recently, we were on a downward trend. I've been in the DNA field a long time. I think a lot of the credit for that actually goes to Mothers and Others Against Drinking and Driving, which way back in the mid-'80s grabbed the rest of us by the shirt collar and said, hey, there's 50,000 people a year dying in motor vehicle accidents that are alcohol related. If that was any other health problem, it would be declared an epidemic. We can't just accept that. We need to look at it. And that set about a change, stronger enforcement in laws, but more importantly, a change in community norms. In the town that I grew up in, Johnstown, it was a steel mill town, it was a coal mining town. Drinking and driving was a way of life. Nobody thought twice about it. Now they do, because the norms are different. We also, you can't see them so well on there, but we have the trends in deaths related to HIV. That peaked in the 90s, and deaths related to guns. But overdoses surpass them all right now. And so what are we talking about when we talk about opiates? Really two categories: prescription painkillers. They go by lots of different names. Most of us have had them prescribed for us: Vicodin, Oxycontin, Percocet, Dilaudid, Opana, some of the generic names: fentanyl, morphine, methadone, and then the street drug heroin. We'll also talk about the fact that some of these are now being manufactured illicitly and mixed in with the heroin. We're going to start, though, talking about the prescription painkillers. When this epidemic first started to get some attention about 3 years ago, we got a number of calls from newspapers and TV stations, and we were very grateful for their attention because we needed as much help, and we still do, to get the word out there. But a lot of times the call would be, we'd like to talk to you about the heroin problem. And we said, well, you can't talk about just the heroin problem. You have to also talk about prescription opiates. And I think even to this day, there's a lack of awareness about how much of a problem we have just with that. Even if we didn't have heroin, we would have a major problem with dependency and overdoses related strictly to prescription opiates. And so my next several slides are going to focus on that. Here's a data bite that I want you to chew on a little bit. Our population, the United States, we make up just a little bit less than 5% of the worldwide population. But for some unknown reason, we consume 80% of the worldwide supply of prescription opioids. Now, in what universe does that make any sense at all? You can't say we have the better healthcare system. We do have the most expensive healthcare system, but by measures that are out there, it's not really the most effective. It really represents a bias in our medical system. And this is something that started to happen in the mid-90s, the late 90s. There was some research back then, and the research said, basically, if you can relieve somebody's pain through prescription painkillers and help them relax, their body will be better able to heal itself. And that will be a good thing. At the same time, some of the pharmaceutical companies were releasing new forms of opiate painkillers that were, according to them, non-addictive. You didn't have to worry about the addiction that was happening with morphine and codeine and some of the other older forms of opiates. Well, fast forward, we found out that that was untrue. Those drugs are very addictive. But what happened is the medical community then adopted what some have referred to as the fifth vital sign. When you go to your doctor with some sort of pain, please rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10. Most of us have experienced that too. And it got built part and parcel into our healthcare system. So much so that hospitals and doctors get rated on how responsive they are to their patients' pain. And if they get bad ratings, it can affect their reimbursement rates. That's how pernicious it is. And we've kind of figured this out now, that this is one example of how complicated this problem is. The sale of prescription painkillers in the United States quadrupled from 1999 to 2010. And there was a parallel rise in overdose deaths. This next chart shows it. The green line, sales of prescription opioids. The purple line, overdose deaths linked not to heroin. None of these are linked to heroin. None of these are linked to alcohol. None of these are linked to cocaine. These are linked to opiate painkillers, prescription painkillers. And the yellow line are people seeking treatment. because of a dependency that they developed on their painkillers. The other thing that we have subsequently learned is that prescription opiates are not really that effective for chronic pain, for long term. They can be very effective in pain associated with a surgery, in short-term pain, but if you use it on a long-term basis, it loses its effectiveness. And in many individuals, it actually creates a lower threshold to pain, so it exacerbates the problem in the long run. Fatal drug overdoses are more common with prescription opiates than heroin, but the gap between the two has narrowed in recent years. I have to say, this slide might not be true anymore. They might be about equal. But let me show you some of the data that led to this conclusion. This is dated 2011. But here again, we've got overdose deaths linked to different categories of drugs. The red line, prescription opioids, not heroin, prescription opioids. The green line, heroin. So as of 2011, we had about 4,000 overdose deaths linked to heroin in this country. The same year, about 13,000, or 3 times that amount, linked to prescription opioids. Now, this can be a result of combining your opioids with alcohol, with benzodiazepines. That combination is particularly dangerous and deadly. The blue line, for your information, is cocaine overdoses. This has changed a bit, though. The highest rate of drug overdose deaths in 2015 was among the 45 to 50-year-old age group. Now that's another one you need to pause and chew on a little bit. Because I think most people look at this and say, oh, it's a heroin problem, it's young people. It's 18 to 30-year-olds. Well, there certainly is a problem with that age group, but it's not limited to that age group. Why do you think 45 to 54 is hit? Come on. I know there's some of you like, well, actually, I'm over that age group. I'm in the 64, up to 64 age group. Yes? That's the age group that you start having pain. Absolutely. We got lots of reasons to go to the doctor and lots of reasons to have pain meds prescribed for us. And so let's see, I think I might have a slide on this. And you can see the 45 to 54 is at the top. But all of them are climbing up. But part of what I'm trying to do tonight is expand your awareness that it's not just a problem in Harrisburg. It's not just a problem with young people. It's not just a problem with heroin users. This opiate crisis is much broader than that. So now let's talk about the link with heroin. The rise in opiate painkiller abuse is fueling now an increase in heroin abuse. About 80% of new heroin users have misused prescription opiates before they ever started to use heroin. Okay? The other thing I'll get to that on this next slide. Despite our best law enforcement efforts, and we really applaud our partners in law enforcement because they're right there standing with us and helping in a variety of different ways, not just with drug enforcement, but we'll talk a bit about naloxone later on. Heroin has never been more pure. It's never been less expensive. It's never been more plentiful than it is right now in our country. And the latest problem is that a lot of it is mixed with fentanyl. You illicitly produce fentanyl, which makes it even stronger and more dangerous. Here's the other problem. Because it's so cheap, if you develop an addiction to a prescription painkiller and your doctor cuts you off, it's cheaper to buy heroin on the street than it is to buy prescription painkillers on the street. The example we have is that a 40 milligram OxyContin will go for about $1 a milligram, $40. You can buy a single dose bag of heroin for $10, oftentimes less than $10. So heroin is starting to replace opioids. Again, I apologize for some of these charts that are dated. It is hard to get national data that's current. Here, you can see the top line is overdoses overall. The middle line are drug overdose deaths linked to painkillers. And the bottom line is heroin. In 2012, we actually thought we had maybe turned the corner on the prescription opioid problem, because look, it's taking a slight downturn, and heroin's starting to climb. But we were wrong about the first one, because it started turning up again, and then this climb has really accelerated. The next couple slides show that. Here's one just looking at overdose deaths linked to opioids. You can see that decline was short-lived, and it started climbing back up again. This is the figure at 2014, higher level than ever. And this is prescription opioids, not heroin. But look at the heroin chart. Look at that climb. That has at least tripled, if not quadrupled, in just 5 years. And so it's a big part of the problem. The next few slides is I want to give some local data, because we've done community substance abuse prevention awareness programs for a long time. And folks in Cumberland and Perry County are always happy to have us there and very polite. But an opinion that sometimes gets expressed is, thank you very much for coming and talking to our group. And it was very, very helpful to hear this. But, you know, thank God we're not as bad as Harrisburg. Or thank God we don't live in York or the city of Lancaster or somewhere else, you know. And one of my jobs here tonight is, if you think that we have a protective bubble over Cumberland County, I want to try and prick that bubble for you and emphasize that we got major trouble right here in River City. So the first piece of local data is from the Cumberland County Prison. In 2015, upon admission to prison, every inmate has to go through a medical screening. Over 1,000 inmates had to be detoxed, not in a formal detox program, but they had to be given medication to help manage withdrawal symptoms. And they only categorize them in two groups, alcohol and opiates or benzodiazepines. The vast majority were withdrawing from opiates or benzodiazepines. That number was more than double what it had been just 4 years earlier. This chart shows that. The green box are inmates being detoxed from alcohol. The blue box are those being detoxed from opiates or benzodiazepines. So it's a major, major cost driver. One of the messages that we try to deliver to all audiences, but especially our legislators and policymakers, is that untreated addiction never just disappears. It shows itself as a cost driver in law enforcement, in our courts and criminal justice, and increases in emergency room care, in increases in child abuse and neglect, domestic violence. It can go on and on. So it's one of those situations where we really need to take the bull by the horns and deal with it head on. The next local indicator is the most chilling source. It's from our Cumberland County Coroner, Charlie Hall. As one just benchmark for perspective, in 2014 in Cumberland County, there were a total of 4 unintentional drug overdose deaths. And that was very, very tragic for those individuals and their families and friends. But fast forward to 2014, we broke a record that year with 35 drug overdose deaths. And 2/3 of those were opiate related. Half heroin, the other half other opiates. 2015, we broke that record again with 41 overdose deaths, about 2/3 opiate related, and here more heroin than other opiates. And in 2016, we blew that number out of the water with 66 overdose fatalities in our communities, in our hometowns here in Cumberland County. And I can tell you that the data for 2017 is not any better. There's already been 17 overdose deaths recorded thus far, and there may be some others since I last spoke to Charlie. I also wanted to share a little bit of information that we have from surveys of high school seniors. I will knock on wood and say that to date, there's not a lot of heroin use among high school students. That's not to say that there isn't some. There certainly is. The last year that we have available is 2 years ago. Every 2 years, the state does a survey called the Pennsylvania Youth Survey, and it looks at lots of at-risk behavior, but it has lots of questions about alcohol and drug use. According to that survey, and looking just at the Cumberland County data, just about 1% of high school seniors reported ever having used heroin. Okay, so that's not a lot, but a decade ago that would have been 0. Even 6 years ago that would have been close to 0. And you do have to take this with a grain of salt, because this, of course, doesn't include people who would have dropped out of school before they completed their senior year. And we do know that there's a high overlap between dropouts and a range of at-risk behaviors, including drug use. Something that is of greater concern, in my opinion, is that 13% of high school seniors reported that they misused prescription opiates for non-medical purposes. And 3% said they did that in the 30 days prior to the survey. The researchers say that is somewhat an indicator of regular opiate use by high school seniors. And so that could be kids that are going to graduate into heroin use. For those that reported prescription drug abuse, the most common sources was they were given it by a friend or by a family member, or they snuck it from their family's medicine cabinet. Okay? So what can be done? We need a comprehensive response. There's no one answer to this. There's got to be lots of answers. We've, in this presentation, boiled it down to at least 5 categories. Law enforcement has to continue. I was very encouraged to hear from Dave Freed, the Cumberland County District Attorney, that in the past year they've been able to beef up the countywide drug task force as a result of some of the larger municipalities dedicating full-time officers to that task force. And we saw just a few weeks ago a pretty major bust of about 40 individuals. And so he's doing his best to try and disrupt the trafficking. And his efforts are focusing on the people who are making money. He's not really trying to put users in jail, but he is willing to use legal charges to encourage users to take advantage of treatment options that are available. And I think that's an appropriate response. reduce the oversupply of prescription painkillers, increase access to naloxone, increase access to treatment, and continue prevention and early intervention efforts. I'm going to run through I'm still pretty good on time, aren't I? Got about 15 minutes, good. I'm going to run through some of the things that we're recommending here and try to identify a few things that you guys, as community members, parents, brothers, sisters, children, can help contribute to the overall effort. First of all, this oversupply of prescription painkillers is amazing. Let me say this. One of the things that we've done, and again, there's been some good leadership from District Attorney Dave Freed on this, is we have set up medication collection boxes throughout Cumberland County. The police departments have taken a lead on this. Most police departments, you'll find a drug collection box. We have one at Dickinson, we have one at Messiah, we have one at Shippensburg University. There's one in the building I work in, the community, the Human Services building, and there's one in the courthouse. What we want everybody to do is take a look in your medicine cabinet. If you haven't done it for a while, you might be surprised at some of the old dusty meds in there. I think by nature we all are a part pack rat. If we pay good money for something, we don't like to toss it away. We don't like to get rid of it. We think, maybe I'll need that antibiotic again. Well, that's a mistake. You know, that doesn't work. You should have used it all when you got it anyway. And so we want people to do an inventory and get rid of anything you're not using anymore. Use these boxes to do it, though. Don't flush it down the toilet. In the first year that those boxes were available in Cumberland County, we collected 4,000 pounds of medication. It's 2 tons. We didn't inventory them. We don't have the resources to do that. But from other collection events, we know that anywhere between 25% and 33% of what gets turned in at collection events or boxes like this are prescription opioid painkillers. So we feel pretty confident in the first year alone that we took about 1,000 pounds of prescription painkillers out of our communities. That's something to be aware of, because when houses are burglarized anymore, it's not just for your money and your jewelry. They're also looking for your medication. We came up with this guy to help promote these boxes. Not in my pond, because we don't want you flushing it anymore. One of the partners in our overdose coalition is the County Recycling Authority. They have pointed out that we have a problem in our waterways with too many medications being flushed, and it's affecting our aquatic life. So now, the best way to get rid of them is through a collection box like this, or if you don't want to do that, the other suggestion is to grind it up with a coffee grinder and mix it in with your used kitty litter or your used coffee grounds, and then just throw it out with your regular garbage. That will make it hard for somebody to try and use. I have to tell you a story about this gentleman. The communications team at Cumberland County did a great job of coming up with a campaign. And on the information table, we have bookmarks and magnets with all the locations of these boxes. Please take some for your home. Everybody loves a refrigerator magnet. And take some to hand out to others so we can get even wider use of these boxes that are available. But we needed a frog, and we couldn't find a copyright-free frog on the internet. So one of the members of the communications team, a friend of hers, said, "I have a frog in my pond." This is a Newville area frog, a local celebrity who's helping us do this. And we decided to name him Prince because of the frog and kissing the frog and becoming Prince. That was before the musician Prince died of an opiate overdose. So it's kind of an ironic and sad story now. But there you have it. Other things about your meds, consider using a lockbox. Some families use lockboxes for your liquor cabinets or your gun cabinets. These pain meds are just as dangerous. Consider doing that if you've got teenagers or young children around. And that goes for grandparents as well. Keep track of your meds, keep a list. Don't share your medication. I did a presentation like this for the adult forum at my church, and it's a great church, St. John's Episcopal in downtown Carlisle. But I have to say that the average age of those faithful attendees at the adult forum is about the mid-70s. And I hear them often talking about their aches and pains and about what medication they've got. So another message is keep a low profile about your aches and pains and what medicine you have, because you could be inadvertently setting yourself up as a target or your home up for a target for burglary. And discuss prescription drug abuse with your children at a young age. Talk to them about how we only use these things according to how the doctor and the pharmacist tells us to use them. Here's another educational piece we put together. It's a little kid looking in the medicine cabinet while his parents talking to a friend saying, I tell you, Bonnie, I always make sure that liquor cabinet is locked. I don't want the kids getting their hands on anything they shouldn't. And here you got maybe a potential smorgasbord in the medicine cabinet. Other things that are being done. Pennsylvania in the fall of 2014 passed a law to implement a stronger prescription drug monitoring system. Unfortunately, it went unfunded for a year and a half, but it is funded. It went live last summer, and we have over 53,000 users of the system. That would be people who prescribe or dispense prescription opiates and some other controlled substances. And we were averaging, this is old data, it's probably higher now, over 25,000 patient searches per day. So now this is a tool for a couple purposes, primarily for doctors, because doctors get people coming to them feigning or exaggerating pain symptoms in order to get a script for pain. I have a friend who's a doctor, and she said within the first 3 weeks of being on this system, she found 3 of her patients who appeared to her to have very legitimate pain needs, but before prescribing, she checked the database and found out, lo and behold, they were already getting pain meds from another doctor. The point of this is not for the doctor to then give the person the bum's rush out the door, but it's to say to them, listen, you do have a health problem, but your health problem appears to be a dependency on medication. And the goal is to get the doctor to attempt to do a brief intervention and a referral to drug treatment for that individual. This same database, though, can be used on the minority of doctors that are abusing their prescribing privileges for profit. And there are some of them out there. They're like pill mills. And this can be, once the pharmacists are in a good position oftentimes to spot some of these dirty doctors. And they can signal law enforcement can get a warrant to be able to use the database to gather that information. So it serves a couple purposes. We also have new legislation that limits the supply of opioids that can be prescribed out of the emergency room and for children. So we're trying to limit. I have to say, I think it's starting to change. At a national level, the number of scripts are starting to slowly go down, but we have so many out there. And I work with the Carlisle Area Health and Wellness Foundation, and we have a we have a physician task force that's looking at this. And some of the physicians have said, you know, the challenge that we're facing really is like the challenge that we face with antibiotics. We kind of screwed up there. We overprescribed them, and we created these superbugs that were resistant to the antibiotics. And so now the medical community is in a multi-year campaign to re-educate us about when it's appropriate to use antibiotics and when not, and when you do get a script, how you have to use the whole script. You can't just stop using when you start feeling better. And they pointed out we need a similar re-education campaign around expectations regarding pain. That when you go to the doctor with pain, maybe when you leave the doctor, you're still going to have some pain. Maybe they'll give you something to relieve it a little bit, but not eliminate it altogether, and change some expectations. It's like MAD changed community norms around drinking and driving. We need to change community norms around how do we deal with pain. Other things that are being done, physicians are being provided with updated training. There's been new best practice guidelines developed for prescribing opioids. They have tools for identifying patients who might be doctor shopping, and they're offering guidelines on how to do brief interventions and referrals to treatment. Another area we talked about, increased access to naloxone. Naloxone is the generic name for Narcan. It's a medication that can reverse an opiate overdose. Very impressive form of medication. It's been used successfully for over 30 years by our partners in emergency medical services. They've been saving lives for decades with this. In the fall of 2014, though, the law was changed, because up until then, only doctors and licensed paramedics could administer it. And so what the change did is it allowed all first responders to use it. And so that has led to an effort to encourage our local police departments and the state police to become trained and to begin carrying naloxone. That's been one of the priorities of our task force. And we now have in Cumberland County all 16 local police departments with officers trained in carrying naloxone. And as of about a month ago, as a result of naloxone administered by those police, 89 lives were saved. And so thank you to our partners in law enforcement for helping in that way. The other thing you need to know is that anybody can now get a script for naloxone. If you have an addiction yourself, or if a family member has an addiction. In fact, it's recommended that even if you have a family member who has a script for opioids for a chronic long-term pain need, you should probably get some naloxone and have it in your medicine cabinet in case they would accidentally overdose on that. I'm going to end my portion now and hand it over to Carol, right? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. And I know just from conversation over the last couple of weeks with people, there are individuals that want to talk with the law enforcement personnel that will be here next week regarding the Narxalon and how that plays a role sometimes in people's mindset as they're using and abusing. So that'll be something we'll be hearing from and addressing next week. In our next 35, 40 minutes, we're privileged to have Fern Wilcox with us. She's Executive Director of Daystar Center for Spiritual Recovery in Harrisburg. This faith community has worked closely with Daystar over the years and knows the value of that ministry and the counseling services they offer there. Fern has spent 31 years working in the addiction field at every level of care, from detox to outpatient. She has a master's of Human Service degree in counseling from Lincoln University. Fern is currently the executive director, as I said, of Daystar, has a private practice helping families through intervention services, and her passion for helping individuals with substance use disorders stems from her own recovery 34 years ago. So we celebrate that victory ongoing in recovery and welcome you, Fern, among us. Won't you welcome her as she comes to share this evening?
Good evening, everybody. First off, I would like to thank Aldersgate. I think as Jack said, this is the only church I'm aware of that has developed a series such as this. And I'm very happy to see our churches getting on board. I want to thank Carol and Pastor Troy for asking me to speak. It's a privilege to be here tonight. I also want to thank Aldersgate for always being a huge support of Daystar. Daystar is a long-term residential treatment facility for drugs and alcohol. Right now, for men, we are looking to expand into treating women as well. This year, we'll celebrate a 20-year anniversary. Past couple years since I've been there, we have developed some new programs. We have a free family program once a month. If anybody is interested, please see me at the end. I can give you my phone number. My brochures and my cards are laid out nicely on my desk back at work. I forgot to bring them. But I'm more than happy to give you my number. And all you need to do is look up Daystar Center for Spiritual Recovery online, and our number is there. Thank you, Jack. What do I push to go forward? The one at the top? Oh, that's the last one I had picked.
That's going backwards. There, one on the right.
Okay.
And then this is a pointer.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Now, I'm going to go right through the statistics because Jack did such a wonderful job. He covered everything I could possibly think of. Tonight, I want to talk about what to look for. Signs of addiction. So many parents, especially in the family program that we run, they want to know what to look for. Loved ones often are the last to know because of denial. Denial not only exists in our clients, but where we see denial the most is in family members. Why do you think that is? Why are family members in more denial sometimes than the addicts themselves? No, they don't want to see it. It's not that we don't love the person. It's not that we don't care. It's not that we don't want to seek help. It's too scary. We don't want to believe it. We don't want to see it. We don't want to deal with it. And sometimes we just don't know how. So I wanted to address some signs and symptoms of especially kids, what they look like when they're using. Social issues are a biggie. People tend to isolate at some point during their drug use, whether it's children won't isolate from their peers, but they'll isolate from their family members. You'll see them spending more and more time in their rooms, out of the house, away from folks that love them and care about them and can see that behavior. High tolerance for drugs or alcohol. This you'll notice maybe in older folks. Don't know what the rules are in your house. In my house, you could have a drink as long as it was in the house. Now, in my house, you could have a drink at Christmas. When I went to visit my sister one time, and I was of age, we went to a bar. She had 2 drinks. I had 20. She said, that's when I knew you had a problem, because I drove home. She couldn't drive after 2 drinks. So it's a tolerance that folks who are addicted end up with, being able to drink huge amounts of alcohol or doing huge amounts of drugs. This is where we run into overdose, because your body can change from one day to the next. If you are an alcoholic, if you are a drug addict, your body one day can decide, not today, I'm done. If you know any alcoholics, as they age, they can drink 1 beer and be relatively tipsy on 1 beer, because the liver decides it doesn't want to process anymore. Weight loss, especially in drug addiction, not so much alcohol. Alcohol tends to make us gain weight. A lot of empty calories in alcohol. But with drug addiction, with stimulants, there's weight loss, and with opiates and so-called things, downers, they can cause weight loss as well. Alcohol, marijuana, not so much. Financial troubles. Financial troubles could be, you notice money missing in your bank account. Financial troubles could be, your loved one may have a problem, they get paid on Friday, and the money is gone by Sunday. A whole range of financial issues. Personality changes is the number one. Very difficult to detect in teenagers. They're all over the board, regardless. They don't need a substance to have mood swings, personality changes. That's part of that lovely stage of growth. You can often still determine drug use or alcohol use, even through the personality changes, through all the other things that we're going to look at. Personal appearance. Someone who used to be very particular about how they dressed, how they looked, how their hair was cut, now is schlepping around in slippers and sweatpants and a t-shirt, and their hair's all over the place. That's a clue, especially for girls. Dilated or constricted pupils. You can look in somebody's eyes and usually tell. With opiates, pupils become very small. With cocaine, meth, speed, large. LSD, pupils become huge. My mother used to give me the pupil test. She would say, look at the light. She was a nurse. Look at the light and then look at me. And if your pupils aren't changing much, there's a problem. Somehow I used to pass that test. Markings on skin. If you see someone walking around in 90-degree weather with long sleeves on constantly, there may be a problem. People who use heroin, people who use any drug intravenously hide where they're using. People typically start out by using in their hands or their arms. Later, they will use in their legs and their feet or anywhere else on their body where they can hide the marks. Sleeping issues. Somebody who used to sleep just fine now isn't sleeping. Up all night, sleeping all day. Sleeping issues can just be a change in sleeping patterns. Again, teenagers can sleep till noon. Hard to tell. But typically, when you see all these things, you can become aware that there are other issues. Slowed motor skills, itching and scratching. Most people are allergic to opiates. Doesn't matter if you become addicted, if you're allergic or not. People will break out in hives, they will start to itch. This is something that you'll see a lot. People itch their nose very slowly. That's a clue. Again, changes in behavior. This could be not necessarily mood swings or personality changes, but behavioral changes. When somebody begins to act differently than you know them to be. Lying when they didn't lie before. Lying about things that there's no need to lie about. Changes in relationships. When you see kids who grew up with a certain crew of friends, now all of a sudden they've left those friends behind and developed a new crowd of friends that you probably don't approve of. Slurred speech, acting out, anger. If you see these things, no matter what happens with the denial, don't ignore them and ask for help. One of our missions at Daystar is to help families. Even if it's a phone call asking, this is what I'm seeing, what can I do? Whether it's a phone call, calling, asking, I have a loved one who needs rehab. I have a loved one who needs interventions. We do interventions. Whatever you need, we're there. Wanted to talk briefly about gateway drugs. There's all different types of thinking. Alcohol, I put the definitions up there. I don't want to go by the PowerPoint. You guys can read. Alcohol, marijuana are typically what they claim to be gateway drugs. Some people don't believe this because they'll tell you, I've smoked pot all my life and I've never moved on to stronger drugs. It's my belief, especially with children, if they're willing to try alcohol, if they're willing to try and sneak and try marijuana, they're going to be willing to try and sneak and try something else. So it typically starts with alcohol, marijuana, cigarettes. Cigarettes are in reality a gateway drug. We don't see it, thank goodness, as much as we used to. People don't smoke as much as they used to. But if you're hanging around with friends that choose to start smoking, chances are they're going to take risks with other things. Again, more information. Stigma. Stigma is our biggest roadblock to recovery. Close your eyes for 3 seconds and envision what a heroin addict looks like. 1, 2, 3. Open your eyes. Anybody willing to share what they saw? Come on. Be brave.
I saw a teenager, a thin teenager.
Any tattoos?
Yes,
Any piercings?
yes, that's what I thought.
Yeah. Anything else? This is our image of, it's not just your image, our image of a heroin addict. Not true. Take a trip to New York City, to the drug area, with men in $1,000 to $2,000 suits who work on Wall Street in the morning before the opening bell, copping heroin. It's unbelievable how many businessmen you will find. High stress, high pressure job. It's amazing. Frightening, actually. The face of addiction is not that image that we see sometimes. Stigma, which is the image that we see in our head sometimes, is one of our biggest roadblocks to getting help, seeking help, helping our loved ones, and finding solutions. Our biggest challenge, and I think we've made huge steps in overcoming stigma, but it remains a challenge and it remains a roadblock. Still, guilt, shame, fear, all kinds of issues come along with the stigma. There is stigma in treatment centers. I have to remind my counselors all the time, clients are doing their job. The clients are doing what clients do. Depending on what age you began using, and it's usually around 13, that's how they act. And staff is constantly amazed. You wouldn't believe what Joe did. Yes, I would. Joe's doing his job. We need to grasp the fact this is what they do. The number one stigma issue is people don't, and I'm putting this up there for you to read, people don't fully understand or comprehend, including myself on some days, that this is a disease. Addiction is a disease of the brain. American Medical Association, I think in the 50s, declared alcoholism a disease. Mental, physical, emotional, spiritual disease. There is no 5-year-old child out there that says, I want to grow up to be a heroin addict. This is nobody's goal in life. Nobody would choose this life, but the stigma involved and the shame and the lack of understanding that it's a disease. When Pastor Bob talked to us about the conversation he overheard in the parking lot, what was your first reaction? What was your second reaction? Good. Yeah. That would have been my first reaction. We're seeing more and more young folks. Young folks aren't great if there's nothing wrong with them. Again, those teen years, it's difficult, it's hard, they're rebellious, they buck the system, they challenge. They're trying to be individuals. Put addiction on top of that, and I want to strangle them. It's hard. If you're going to be angry, please be angry at this disease. Please put your energy where it works the most. It does not, and I'm guilty of this. I go in my office, I close my door, I sit down, I count to 10, and I breathe because I want to strangle people. I can't do that. I'm supposed to be patient, kind, and tolerant. It's very hard to wrap our heads around the fact that this is a disease and that person has very little control of what they're saying and what they're doing until they get some recovery under their belt. These are some of the effects of stigma. Preventing stigma. Challenge your own beliefs. When you closed your eyes and you saw the tattooed, pierced young person, challenge your belief system. My husband was a heroin addict who ran a successful business on the main line of Philadelphia and wore a suit and a white shirt and a tie to work every day. Never missed a day of work. Went to North Philadelphia every morning on the train before work and copped heroin. He died at the age of 35. He was also retired at the age of 35. Challenge your belief system. Again, brain disease. And that's a lecture for a whole other day. Google it, look it up, learn it, understand it, and try and wrap your head around it. Be angry at the disease. Be disgusted with the disease. The key is education. Educate, educate, educate. Speak out. I go to churches, I speak about addiction, I talk about Daystar. I ask the congregation to share with me. Doesn't happen. When church is over, I wait in the back of the church. Never have I been to a church where someone has not come up to me and said, my granddaughter died, my grandson died. But there's so much shame and stigma, they can't share that in the congregation. To me, the congregation is your biggest source of love, support, family. That's where you should be able to share it. So we really need to reduce the stigma. Prevention. The number thing I want to say about prevention is if you do not reach a child by the age of 8, you might be too late. Their little minds are set at that early of an age. If you can reach them before that, and we say, oh no, that's too young. I don't want them to even know about drugs and alcohol. You'd be surprised what they already know. Age appropriate talk about drugs and alcohol. Honesty. Children will, when you bring up the topic, they'll respond with their questions, and when they are satisfied, they will walk away, and you will be relieved. Just like the big talk that you have to give them at some point, they'll ask you questions, then they're done with it. They need to be introduced at a young age. Daystar is also willing to come out to your churches and help you with that issue. It's a difficult topic. Ask them questions. Ask them what do they know already. And it's frightening, but it's open lines of communication are the most important thing. Explain if there's any risk factors in your family. Uncle Joe that we don't talk about, who was an alcoholic, let them know. Don't be a no-talk family. Stop the shame. Open lines of communication. Number one tool in your toolkit to combat this horrible disease. Tonight, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about my own recovery. God willing, I will have 34 years of recovery in September. I've worked in the field of addiction for 31 years. Back in the day, which I can't believe I'm even saying, AA and NA have traditions. Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. In the last 5 years, this has changed significantly. Long-term recovery folks are coming out of the closet for one reason. People don't believe recovery works. People don't believe that other people find recovery. People don't believe treatment works. It works. I was one of those creepy 22-year-old kids that I so love now who found recovery. Nice family. I grew up in a wonderful family. Grew up in Hershey. Of course, there was no drug problem there. Really good childhood. Some trauma that probably had earmarks for my addiction. My mother was left handicapped by a surgeon's mistake a year before I was born. She was not supposed to have me. I was supposed to be an abortion. I grew up in the church. My mother refused. She hid her pregnancy for 5 months, refused to have an abortion. Grew up with a good religious foundation in my life. Became an alcoholic and a drug addict. There was no history in my family of addiction. Maybe my grandfather being locked up for selling numbers, could have been a gambling addiction. Things came out later, after I got to rehab. Family secrets. Nobody wanted to talk about them. It was too shameful. Imagine what it was like back then. We've made huge progress. I moved to the Philadelphia area when I was 17 because I quit school 6 weeks before graduation. My father worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Education, and I was an embarrassment, so I moved. My sister worked in a detox. She would come home and tell me stories of people finding recovery. And I used to think, why is she telling me? By the time I hit the age of 22, I had my spiritual awakening. I was living on the streets of Chester. Anybody knows where that is? Probably the only young white girl for miles. Living in an abandoned house and my car. Woke up one morning, 7 o'clock, went to the bar for my bird bath, looked in the mirror, did not know the person looking back. And all of a sudden, a light came on. A light came on in a lot of darkness. And I was able to see that I didn't know the person in the mirror. And I called my sister. I said, I think I'm ready to get help. Of course, I expected her to get me help. She gave me the phone number of her detox, where she worked, of the doctor, and I made the phone call. I became tired of seeing the pain in everybody's face. I take no credit for my own recovery. I know that it was all God. It certainly was not me at 22. For 29 years before I got to Daystar, I worked in the field. Every level of care, detox in North Philly. I had many wild adventures, really good training, to high-end rehabs, Cairn Foundation, Malvern Institute. I found my home where I am now because something I believed in all my life, I finally realized for me, in my opinion, was true. The one thing missing in most treatment programs is spirituality. And allowing people to find their spirituality and encouraging that and watching it grow. I believe that's the only reason I was able to stay clean and sober at the age of 22. Certainly was not my own idea. I did not have enough clarity. I did not have enough courage. I did not have enough sense to do it on my own. I didn't listen to people. I didn't follow all the rules. I can look back and see where God walked me through every step of the journey. A few years into recovery, I said I was 28. My husband, who was 35, died of an overdose. I didn't pick up. I didn't want to go back to that life. That's all I knew, is I didn't want to go back to a life of hurting people. They tell you in AA and NA, you have to do this for yourself. You can't do it for anybody else. I didn't like myself enough to do it for myself. I did it for my mother, my father, my sister, and my 2 baby nephews that I love to death. I cannot get out of my head the picture of them waving to me as they dropped me off at rehab. I went to the worst rehab on the planet. The rehab I went to was in Chester as well. To help reduce the stigma of addiction, I wanted to share a piece of my story tonight. My clients will come over to my office and say, well, I know you're not in recovery. And I'll say, well, how do you know that? Because you don't look like a drug addict. I smile. I say, thank God. And I tell them, when you complete treatment, I will tell you the truth. So I let them think for a couple months. I like that I don't look like a drug addict today. I didn't look like a drug addict then either. I was very sweet, very kind, very loving, and my nails were always done. That's what made me think I was okay. Living on the street in Chester, in a shooting gallery, my nails were done. So I wanted to share hope tonight. Hope that people do recover for a long, long time. And I only have today, and I know that. And I pray that I'll get tomorrow. It does not happen without love and support. And I truly believe it doesn't happen without God. Thank you for allowing me to be here tonight.
Thank you very much, both of you, and Pastor Bob as well. Earlier this afternoon, a reporter from Channel 8 said, why is the church doing this? And I said, well, and I apologize ahead of time if this offends any of you, but it's just, I sort of talk with what comes to my mind, and I trust it's Christ. I said, it seems like we live in a world where people seem to outdo each other in trying to scare the hell out of everybody. I mean, it's in the headlines, it's in the politics, it's in the news cycles, and it's even in churches. And really what God sent Jesus for was to love us in our brokenness and to build a kingdom here and to come. He taught us to pray. And I said to the reporter, I think the real reason, that we're led to do this is because we pray that our hearts hurt for what God's heart breaks for. That's really the core of the gospel. And Jesus' first message, his first public preaching, he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. And one of the realities of the church in its own arrogance sometimes is we fail to recognize our own brokenness. And when we fail to do that, we get pretty pious and cannot engage the brokenness of the world. That's why Jesus allowed himself to be broken on the cross. So that's a core of why we're doing this in a faith community context. And I'm just blessed by the comments tonight, the information, because I confess that 6 months ago, I felt aware of what I was reading in the news, but I was stunned to realize I'm pretty ignorant about this. And to be a person positioned, hopefully, for the gospel and the hope of Christ, you need to inform your brain. And when our brains are informed, oftentimes our hearts are then opened. And we can meet anyone in any level of brokenness because God is with us and equipping us. I want to, in these moments before we go to question, just acknowledge and with deep appreciation Carol Diffenbauer, Director of Health and Nurture Ministries here, who, if God really did stir in me a desire to do something with this, it was Carol who really takes some of that vision or possibility and made the connections. And as you look at the coming weeks, there's loads of information and loads of equipping us informationally that I believe the Spirit will use for us as we go forth from here. So, Carol, I just want to thank you for your efforts.